All right, here we are back again with number 18, and a bit of a delay, but let's jump into it.
Yeah, so as always, we're going to start off with my summary, then we'll start conversation after. So, episode 18 is about Plotinus and Neoplatonism, or perhaps more accurately, laying the groundwork for the emergence of Neoplatonism. In the last lecture, in episode 17, Vervaeke spent a lot of time discussing the cognitive science of Gnosis. He rehashes some of this, and to remind ourselves, we have this concept of being existentially stuck or having existential inertia, which describes a situation where we can't seem to inhabit a worldview or the agent-arena relationship that we want. We can't seem to make that worldview viable to us. This is a good way of phrasing it. The Gnostics engaged in serious play, where they performed rituals that attempted to put them into this liminal space, this space between the real and the imagined. And this afforded the participants an opportunity to inhabit a worldview in a way that may permit them to have the anagogic transformation that they were seeking. In a sense, this is a psychotechnology developed to aid radical transformation. Vervaeke emphasizes that Gnosis is best attempted in the context of a community with a shared mythology, well-developed psychotechnologies, and the potential for sapiential feedback. Sapiential here referring to wisdom. So if a community is giving sapiential feedback, it refers to the idea of social capital, perhaps to use another term, being present in the community that can give correction when and if the Gnostic practices start to go wrong. Now, with the cognitive science aspect described in the last lecture, Vervaeke goes on to expound a bit on the historicity of the Gnostic movement. One thing to recall is that the Hellenistic age, or the age of anxiety, which, to remind ourselves, was a period of time when Alexander conquered most of the known world, at the time only to have the empire collapse after his death. All of that resulted in the rise of Stoicism, Epicureanism, and also of Gnosticism. Christianity was also a response to this. And this is relevant because these traditions begin to cross-pollinate with each other, and certainly the Gnostic movement was one that became enmeshed with Christianity, although it was not a perfect overlap. Now, while the Gnostics had a lot of scriptures and mythologies, there's one that is more well-known than the rest, and it's an adaptation of Plato's idea. And to remind ourselves, Plato thought that what was truly real, with a capital R, was the world of forms, or eidos, which is in some respect the world of abstractions. A chair doesn't exist in this room or another room. Only an iteration of a chair exists in the material world. The truth, with a capital T, of a chair exists primarily in the world of forms. But how then does this eternal, timeless, dimensionless idea of a chair express itself in the material, physical world that we inhabit? How does time intersect with eternity? Plato's solution for this was the demiurge, a mythological abstraction that was the intermediary principal intellect responsible for expressing the eidos of things in the material world. The demiurge was not the source or truth, but merely the mechanism by which the truth was shaped in the temporal and material world. The Gnostics took this idea and they ran with it. They say that the many gods of the worlds of their time, they were all demiurges. They were all just intermediaries between the material world that we inhabit and the ultimate source of truth, with a capital T, the God above all gods. They went further and said that these demiurges or gods were either evil or incompetent or stupid, and proof of this was how much suffering there was in the world. The road to salvation lay not in worshipping any of these false idols, but in transcending them entirely to the God above all gods. Now, why are we discussing this ancient metaphysical philosophy in a course called the Meaning Crisis, or Awakening from the Meaning Crisis? And the answer is that this mythology persists in a fashion to this day. Instead of demiurges, we now see large abstractive systems like our socioeconomic system, sociocultural system, perhaps even our monetary system, as demiurges that craft the world that we live in today and which trap us and cause us suffering. There is, in this sense, our modern there is in the sense of our modern mythologies being in a state of suffering because of the incompetence of or the evil nature of forces that are larger than ourselves, forces that are godlike in their pervasiveness and power overness, but they're not God unto themselves. The Matrix, Star Wars are example of mythologies expressed like this in the modern terms. Now, this mythology has a dark side because it is inherently conspiratorial. Your life is terrible, the Gnostics will say, because of an external other force. They, for example, believe that Jesus was a teacher that preached a way to reconnect with the God of all gods, and the Old Testament God was yet another demiurge. And who worshipped the gods of the Old Testament? Well, it was the Jews, of course, and that might be one source of anti-Semitism. But whether the dark side converges on anti-Semitism or not, there is a problem with having one's mythology be incorporated in one's mythology, a rejection of all current systems as being invalid. It can quickly pathologize into violence fairly easily. Now, the upside to this mythology, and is perhaps why Vervaeke is bringing it up at all, is that for our modern times, it allows us a path forward to pursue a sense of the sacred without having to believe in the God of theistic religions. You don't have to believe in Allah or the Trinitarian God of Christianity or the God of the Hindus. You can call them all demiurges, as the Gnostics did, and lay claim to the possibility of a sacred experience that transcends them all. And this is finally where the lecture ends with a relatively brief introduction to Neoplatonism, which is something I wish he had expanded on a little bit more, because he describes himself, Vervaeke does, in other lectures as a Neoplatonist, and I was always wanting him to expound exactly on what he means by that. But this conversation leads us to Plotinus, who is the father of Neoplatonism, and he took all of the sort of current systems of thought at the time that were prevalent at the time and integrated them together. So Plotinus had Gnostic students. So he was aware of the notion of transformative participatory knowing. He also read Aristotle, who had discussed the transition. One of Aristotle's many ideas was, and we discussed this in a previous lecture, the idea of potentiality and actuality, that you can have raw potentiality that moves upwards, up a sort of chain of evolution, if you could say, or transformation to actuality. To realization. It becomes more real as it goes up that ascent from potentiality to actuality. And Plotinus saw this move from potentiality to actuality as representing movements through more and more real levels of reality. And not real in the intellectual sense, but real in the felt sense, in the participatory knowing sense. As we move from potentiality to actuality, we are better integrated. And being better integrated is what gives us the signal of increased realness. That's how we know something is real. Levels of reality become more real the more we move up the integration scale. And this move up to greater levels of integration is Plato's anagoge. And at each level that we inhabit of realness, we are transforming and conforming ourselves to that plane of reality, which again is an Aristotelian idea. But what then lies at the top or the bottom, which depending on how you're measuring it, of this hierarchy of realness? What lies at the top is that which integrates everything, the one. And since the one integrates everything, it cannot be experienced with the intellect or with language, because using those things will, again, fragment things. This is something that is the one in the sense of not the singularity, but perhaps the totality. The way to experience the one is not to try to understand it intellectually, but to experience it gnostically. To gnostically experience it is something that resembles a higher state of consciousness, a form of enlightenment. And that is sort of where he sort of leaves the lecture off, concluding my summary.
This was a complicated one. Your summary lasted almost as long as my summary.
10 minutes. It's pretty good for 10 minutes.
I mean, just because it was complex, right? So one thing I wanted to maybe just put out to you and just get your thoughts on is there a conflict between two ideas that are being presented here, right? One is, okay, if you take the Aristotelian view that as you ascend from potentiality to actuality, you are making something more real, right? In some ways, you can conceive of that as a demiurge, right? Is you're taking the form of something, the ideal of something, and instantiating it into the world, right? But Plato would claim that that was less real. That in fact the form of a chair was more real than an instance of the chair. But in some way, the form of a chair is merely the potential to have a chair, right? And so I feel like there's a conflict there between maybe the Aristotelian view and the Platonic view in those frameworks, in which one is the movement towards greater realness.
Oh, that's an interesting idea. I don't think so. A way of looking at the Aristotelian ascent, anagoge, moving up the scale of integrated realness, I suppose, right, or moving up the scale of realness, via increased integration, is sort of just moving up the hierarchy of forms. You are getting closer and closer to the good. Right, if that is going to be the ideal form that you're getting at, so it's bridging the gap between the imperfect material being that you are, and the perfect eidos. Right, you're of course you're not going to be the actual perfect eidos, but you are reinstantiating yourself at each level of reality or abstraction to get closer to the good. In this case, it's defined as the one. There hasn't been much discussion about what the good is, and that's why I wish this was a bit explicated a bit more. What does it mean to move up the anagogic Neoplatonic, in the Neoplatonic tradition? What does it mean? Because we have a sense of what it means when it comes to the Buddhist tradition, right, which is sort of the extinction of the ego and re-evaluating the nature of reality itself or the self as being illusionary, and perhaps that is the good in the Buddhist tradition. But in the Platonic tradition, there usually is a moral underlay, right? There's usually some sort of a specific living in the worldness kind of goal. Like, how should you best orient yourself to live in the world, and that is the orientation that you're trying to get up to anagogically. So it's not really explicated in this what it means to ascend up. What that looks like in a embodied human. If I saw you tomorrow and you had ascended all the way up, how would you be different, right? I don't know the answer to that, right? Maybe you did yesterday, and this is as good as it gets. Who knows?
That's my claim.
Right?
No. Oh, yeah. I guess I still feel like there is some conflict there, and maybe I'll just put another. And maybe I could be wrong. So let's just talk it out. Like, I can conceive in some way. I think there is some way in which E equals MC squared is more real than a physical object moving. But there's also a way in which the physical object moving is more real than the abstract notion of E equals MC squared. And I think there's a tension there in terms of, it's hard for me to conceive clearly that one is I think they're more. Each of those is more real, but in a different sense of realness.
Yeah. I do think he goes over this in the next lecture when he starts talking about St. Augustine. I went through the lecture a little bit before, and he does talk about no, both are actually real,
right?
As well. And again, we're getting ahead of ourselves here. We haven't gone over that lecture in detail, but I do see what you're saying.
And I think the reason that becomes important, at least in this lecture, is, okay, because you're asserting a value hierarchy towards the one, right? And so if you say, well, no, E equals MC squared is more real, and we need to ascend toward that as the ideal, that denies to me the flip side of that is like, hey, if I punch you in the face, then on some level, what's most real is the kinetic energy, and that as I accelerate my hand in the frame of reference of your face, it gains mass because velocity adds to mass, and so it's a little more weighty, and it's slowed down in time relative to your face, and all those things are true. What's more real to you is being punched in the face, is the pain you experience, the qualia of that experience. And so I wonder about the notion there. Is there a way of conceiving, or is there a way of more clearly understanding the value hierarchy that accounts for both aspects of reality and incorporates it maybe into a one? Maybe there is a one that includes both of those senses of reality that seem to be in tension, but maybe that's a paradox. Maybe the real one incorporates both senses of reality.
I think that because it's the totality, right? It's all that exists, right? So I think that dichotomy would probably, be meaningless, right? Because it contains everything. The one would, contain it all.
Well, but this gets into the notion of what do we mean by exists? Like, what does it mean for something to exist? Like, I gave this example actually in a previous recent discussion on philosophy about this topic. Is we've calculated pi to 1 trillion digits or whatever we have, right? So does the Google digit of pi exist? Or does it only exist once we calculate it and know what it is, once we've instantiated it, right? What do we mean by exist? And so, like, we can't predict it. We don't know what that digit is. There's no way to know other than to compute it out and to get there. And so, and yet the notion of pi does exist, right? That we can be expressed as a ratio, for instance, or it can, I don't know. I think that notion of existence is a bit tenuous.
I think what you might be struggling with is, the attempt to describe what is it to experience the one, right? And Vervaeke makes, pains to point out that you can't really understand it. You can't talk about it. Language won't get you there. You can only gnostically experience it, right, through a sort of higher state of consciousness. And once you do sort of grok it or grasp it or conform to it or whatever, the experience, right, it doesn't lend itself to language.
I can buy that. I think so, I get that, and I think that's not far-fetched. However, it's also a bit easy, right? It's a bit facile in the sense of, if I say, hey, you're saying two contradictory things, and your response is, well, you just have to experience it, right? That comes off as a bit facile.
It sounds like somebody has been held hostage to propositional tyranny.
Correct. Yeah. Exactly. Exactly right.
That's what's happening here. Victim number one right here.
No, I mean, it's challenging, right? Because on the one hand, I totally agree that
sure.
I think there are truths that can only be experienced, that can't be really described very well. But at the same time, if we're asserting that, and we have to assert that through a contradiction, I think that there's a difficulty there, and a bit of ambivalence, and maybe what I'm concerned about is, are we accidentally being a bit slick by using the term exist in two different ways? And it actually means two different things, but we're hinging on the fact that our language uses the same word for things that actually are different.
Well, where you're using the word exist, I wonder if you could replace it with reality, right? And then, to sort of come back to Plotinus, there's levels of reality, right? So the existence becomes more real, I suppose, as you go up that hierarchy, right? So perhaps the definition is sort of malleable as you move up the hierarchy of reality as well. So perhaps, everything is, perfectly dichotomized, from my unenlightened perspective. There's a material world and then there's Plato, right? It's perfect dichotomy, right? And as I move up the sort of plane of integration, this is kind of mystical. Sure. This is one of the things I wanted to talk about as well. As we sort of move up the increasing levels of reality, what we perceive to exist, then also sort of shifts. Perhaps we may, for a good example, we may feel God, right? Much more. I mean, this is just an analogy. I'm not saying this would happen, but people who have religious transformations, when they do, they're like, oh, I felt God, I felt the divine, or I felt the sacred. Now, they didn't feel that right before the transformation. So now something has come into their consciousness, their subjective experience of realness and what exists that did not occur before, right? Now, did that just materialize? Yeah, that's a poor choice of word.
Yeah.
But, did that just come out of nowhere? Did it not exist before, but now it did exist, right? So
that feeling?
Perhaps another way of...
the feeling?
Okay. Yeah, the sense that, I have connected to something that was there that I didn't connect to before. Like, I'm in the presence of something that I was not in the presence of before. I'm beholding the presence of something, right? That I did not detect before, and then you sort of move up the plane of what you're appreciating as existing or reality, right? I wonder if your struggle with the word existence is just that the definition is the same as you keep moving up the chain or the anagogic sort of ascent.
Well, it's a little bit different than that. I think the problem is that these writers, these thinkers, are trying to define up. Right? They're trying to say, well, there is a higher level of value here in this direction toward, I guess, the forms, toward the more the more abstracted view. But then I think that there is a tension there between the abstraction and the instantiation.
I didn't actually know. That's interesting because I didn't actually think of it as an ascent to the forms. I didn't think it was, because remember, Aristotle wasn't entirely convinced of the forms as being static, right? Like his whole contribution was that he thought of them as like dynamical, right? Interplaying with, in those dynamical systems theory, if you recall. So the ascent is not so much towards the forms as it is towards, perhaps integrating better with the forms. Again, language is a bit clunky when you're talking about something that's essentially mystical. We are getting very esoteric. We can keep talking about this for a while, but we're probably going to bore a lot of people listening to us. I
think that happened several episodes ago. I think people easily
no one's watching.
Those who are easily bored have already left us. I think we're this is episode 18.
True,
I don't think we.
Yeah. Well, we can continue pulling on this thread. I don't feel like I have anything useful to contribute because it just seems like I don't really know. It's getting to a point where semantics starts breaking down, and it becomes difficult to...
Wittgenstein would say that that's the only point. That's the only conversations worth having, is where language breaks down. No, I mean, again, I think that the yeah, I mean, I guess I perceive a tension there that is not being acknowledged, and in terms of what we mean by more real, and I don't quite know, and then I don't know how to proceed, right? Because he's saying, okay, well, we're integrating it in this way, moving up the chain. So, and I'm like, yeah, but you're using a word in two different ways, and so I don't know where to go.
Yeah, no, I'm completely sympathetic. Like the entire, the Plotinus and Neoplatonism, and this whole ascent thing, it was literally the last 5 minutes of the lecture, right? And and even though the lecture is called Neoplatonism, I was really excited because he talks a lot about Neoplatonism in many other places, and in order to try to understand this lecture a little better, I watched another lecture where he spoke at Rawlings College about Neoplatonism and cognitive science 4E, where he explicates a lot of this a bit more. It's a 3-hour lecture, so I'm only halfway through. But I'm hoping at some point he expands a lot more on, a more complete sense of what Neoplatonism really is, right? I agree with you. This explanation of it is very abstract. It's to use a phrase I like using a lot. It's difficult for me to operationalize. I don't know how to turn it into any kind of practice or perspective at all. And as it is the case with a lot of his lectures, is when I go through them, so a good example is I don't think I would have gotten this definition of Gnosticism or this understanding of Gnosticism anywhere else. And I have looked
Yeah,
into other
sure.
videos, and it's just completely impenetrable,
Sure.
right? But this makes a lot more sense, since he's done a lot of work to lead us to this point. But the biggest things I get from his lectures is that it's a launching off point to like, oh, okay, now I have this basic idea.
Sure.
Now I can have an intelligent conversation about Gnosticism and go in depth in this direction. Now I have some inclination of the philosophical heritage that preceded Neoplatonism and the milieu in which it arose. So now it makes a lot. I don't know why everyone else doesn't do it this way, right? You need to have the historicity of the idea. Why would this idea come up in this place? What else influenced this idea? This drives me crazy when someone describes something, as complicated as this, right? With just like definitions, and no context, no backstory, like this is how it arose. So this is one of those things where I feel like I have it in context. Neoplatonism is what I'm referring to. And it's going to take more work for me to try to dive into it. But getting the context, at least, the sort of ontology of it is, I think, the most important first step in understanding anything that I'm studying, especially when it's confusing stuff like this. So I don't have the answer to your question.
Yeah, I mean, sure. No, we can move on. I think we're both maybe a little bit. Yeah, just leave that as as something we don't understand. I think that's fine. I will say. I mean, I think I'm emotionally oriented a little differently than you in that regard. Like, I don't know that I typically gain a ton of value or find a lot of value in having historical context. The reason, however, I find this context useful is that, if you're not familiar with Christianity, then understanding the Gnostics is going to be hard, right? Because I have to actually teach you Christianity in order to understand, because I can't shorthand that, right? Because it's a response to something. It's they're playing on certain ideas, and the same thing is true of like the Stoics in some sense. Is like you can evaluate Stoicism in a vacuum to some degree, right?
Sure, I think that's fair.
But
yes.
but it also is important to realize that the people there were feeling certain things that maybe we are feeling as well, right? And this is partly an emotional response to that. And so where I'm a little bit going with that is I think that this lecture series bridges the edge of philosophy and psychology. And I think that the philosophy, to some degree, you can evaluate in a vacuum. And I think a lot of people try to do that. And the psychology, you cannot. Because the understanding the psychology of what someone is saying in terms of what it means, the meaning crisis, right? You need to know their context. You need to know as much as possible about their experience in order to understand the meaning they're assigning to certain things psychologically. Whereas if I'm asserting truth value, which is closer to what philosophy is closer to science in that regard, maybe, because I'm not asserting, or I'm not trying to assert a subjective truth with philosophy. I'm trying to assert an objective truth in some way with most philosophy, maybe not all. Whereas psychology is fundamentally a subjective truth question, right? Is, do I find this meaningful? Well, that's an internal experience. That's dependent on my context and my understanding and all these things. So because he's on the edge of that, I think some of these things I'm like, yeah, you could explore Stoicism as a philosophy on its own. But understanding Stoicism as a psychology, as a commentary on the experience of meaning, no, you need the context. And so it's just a bit different, I think, because that's the project.
Changing track just a little bit over here. One of the things that one of the terms I ran into as I was just sort of studying around the lecture is the term, the perennial philosophy. You must have heard of this, right? Have you heard of the perennial philosophy idea? So, there's I think it's a pretty old idea, a few hundred years old, but popularized in modern times by Aldous Huxley, who wrote a book called The Perennial Philosophy, where and this lecture is apropos of this, where he talks about how all religions are really pointing to the same kind of sacred truth. And all of them are just sort of, talking around that idea. If, the right kind of spiritual scaffolding will get you to the same destination. And, I have yet to get into Neoplatonism in more detail and read Plotinus myself, but I would be surprised if I would be surprised if I don't find somewhere Plotinus being described as a kind of mystic.
I mean, no, I don't know. No, I'd be surprised as well if he's not. No, I don't know that, but I would have the same surprise.
Yeah. So, and it reminds me again of, we discussed with the Buddha as well, and we had a long conversation about what higher state of consciousness meant. We had a bit of a disagreement there. And this is yet another iteration, another place where we're finding this concept of a, transcendent experience, right? Where the Buddha, he was at one with everything, and now we hear, the phrase "the one again." Even though Plotinus existed, several centuries after the Buddha, I doubt really that there was any kind of cross pollination with Buddhism and the ideas of Plotinus at this time. So independent cultures here have converged on the same kind of idea, right? That there is some sort of a transcendent reality. That and we the higher state of consciousness lecture talked about this as well, that when people perceive this reality, they feel it as more real and true and real with a capital R than the reality, the plane of reality they've been experiencing before that experience. And it almost seems to me that a lot of modern thinking about meaning and purpose seems to kind of completely ignore this phenomenon, right? It's almost like the quantum physics problem, of the observer effect, right? Like, what are you going to do, right? If you look at the thing, it collapses it just happens, and there's no real explanation. They're just like pigeonholed, like, yeah, that's a thing. We completely acknowledge it exists. It makes no sense at all. It has very profound implications that might upend our entire view of how reality works. But we're just going to ignore it because everything else around it works just fine, right? Sure. So just don't press that button, please. Don't rock the boat.
Don't open that Schrodinger's
And I kind of feel like
the cat might die.
And I kind of feel we do the same thing when we discuss religion or meaning or purpose. Part of it is, of course, is these very higher states of consciousness, enlightened state of consciousness, like the Buddhas, are impossible for most people to achieve, and so it's like, well, you may be 1 in a billion or 1 in 100 million that actually experiences it. So it's not useful, right? But in many cases, the extremes, the extreme event can, like a black swan, or a white swan for that matter, can point to a much deeper underlying truth that most society just ignores, right? Until it just becomes, at least to the individual. If you tomorrow had an experience like that, right, you would perhaps be very different, right? And you're like, how come no one else is talking about this, right? And I keep coming back to this, right? It's one of the things these material atheists, like just don't have a good explanation for, like how they can say, well, these people are just deluded, but I just don't think that's true, right? I don't think that this transcendent experience is a self-delusion. It's not just a bunch of chemicals. They're gonna probably say something about the pineal gland and endorphins and the receptors. All bullshit, right? It's just garbage, right? There's no explanation for it, right? And there's just yet another, in this journey of thinking about meaning and purpose, yet again running into this idea of the transcendent, the sacred, right? And being able to connect to it in a non-propositional way, and that not being further explicated, right? I mean, the atheists don't really have, and I speak as a non-theist myself, atheists don't really have a commentary on what this experience could mean, right? I mean, strangely enough, Sam Harris, right, who's quite the meditator, very involved with Buddhist traditions, doesn't really have a great explanation. He'll come up with some functional MRI study that'll poo-poo this away, maybe.
Well,
but I don't know what your thoughts on that were.
Well, I think again, I don't know that we can be so quite so cavalier about the materialist atheist view, in that we shouldn't just dismiss it as garbage. I think that the the fundamental thing happening there is the philosophy term is it's a deflationary theory of meaning, right? Is the reason you can't figure out what things mean is because nothing means anything, right? And so the terminology doesn't refer to anything, and thus you get twisted into knots anytime you try, right? I think that's the fundamental, that's the direction materialist atheism goes, right? Is you have no free will, nothing you do matters or means anything, and so the entire notion of meaning is a bit deflationary because it's all just the Big Bang playing itself out, right? Which I think is, the credit you have to give to it is that it's logically consistent in some way, right? Like, I think there are flaws with it.
How so? You mean material atheism is logically consistent? Is that
For the most part, yeah. I think there are holes you can. I think there are holes you can poke in it in certain sophisticated ways. But for the most part, it's a logically consistent point of view. Now, nobody actually believes it, right? And that's kind of one of the things I point out is that, like, if somebody, if your spouse cheats on you, you don't go, well, Big Bang playing itself out. Like, you say, no, you shouldn't have done that, right? Like, we have that emotional reaction regardless. And so there's a conflict, and that it means something, right? It feels like it means something. That's your inner truth if you're honest with yourself psychologically. And so then the materialist atheist view creates quite a hypocrisy between your intellectual expressed beliefs and your functional psychological beliefs, the ones you actually operate on day to day, and you become it creates this odd duality because there's no way to square those two things, right? You're not going to stop believing in the concept of should. You're not going to stop trying to make better decisions, or you're not really going to do any of those things. You just continue to exist and propagate something you don't, I say, really believe. You may believe it intellectually, but you don't believe it psychologically, right? Which puts you in an odd position. So I think that's a lot of where we've kind of ended up, and it is around this idea of meaning is hey, I had this experience. What did it mean? I tasted a strawberry. It doesn't have to be anything as amazing as enlightenment. I just tasted. What does that mean? Well, from a materialist standpoint, it doesn't mean anything. It was. There is no taste there. It's just explosion of chemicals or like atoms. It's atoms and electrons moving like that. There's no meaning beyond the existence and the thing is doing the thing, right?
Well, I guess what I was getting at when I said meaning with these transcendent experiences is not so much, in the meaning purpose sense, in the scientific sense, right? So where in the material scientism worldview is there space for something like the transcendent experience, right? I don't think that there really is. And if there isn't, then what does material, scientism, material atheism, how does it explain that away, right? The fact that throughout many, many different cultures, various, religious ideas have converged on the notion that there is such a thing as a transcendent experience. I think every single religious tradition has a sect or some sort of offshoot that, like the the Jewish people have the Kabbalah, and the Muslims have the Sufis, and there's a lot of mystic traditions in Christianity. The Buddhists, that's that's
far
their
be it from me to defend
sort
materialist
of
atheism, but yeah, I don't. Again, I don't think they need to explain it any more than they say. You can say, well, many cultures over different years have come up with the concept of God. Okay, as a materialist atheist, they're wrong, right? And this, hey, they've had this experience of it was an illusion.
But at the same time, you could find people who have perhaps gone through these transformative experiences, and this is one of the things that Vervaeke points out is like, almost universally, people who do, they end up, living better lives, right? That they're healed in some way, they're better integrated in some way. Like, it is by all measures a positive experience, things that you can measure with science, right? So, unlike God, this is a measurable phenomenon.
I don't think you can measure it with science. I guess that's kind of my point, actually, because there's no place in materialist atheism for a value hierarchy either. You can't say better because...
Okay, you could say different, though, right? And so that's still a differentiator, right? It's a signal of an event having transpired. because there's now a difference in the person's life before and after the event.
Again, I don't think there is. That's
There's
kind of
some-
my point, right? Is it's just a bag. Like, you really have to get, if you're taking the materialist atheist view, you really have to get into the view and say it's just a bag of atoms. There is no difference. It's a bag of atoms. It was a bag of atoms before this set of interactions, and it's a bag of atoms after this set of interactions. So
Sure, but the bag of atoms are interacting and behaving somewhat differently before and after the experience. And so
in what way
what
are
is
they?
the hypothesis
They're
to
not differently. It's
explain-
the same laws of physics. There's no difference. What's the difference?
So if you were to say that an experience like this would materially improve a person's sense of well-being, kick an addiction, improve their lives in all manner of different ways,
What-
you could point to that
what is
difference and say,
well-being?
okay, some event
What is an
occurred.
addiction? None of these terms have any meaning.
Well,
from a
okay, so if we're
materialist
just going to
atheist
be
standpoint.
like completely, what's that?
From a materialist atheist standpoint, well-being, addiction, these terms have no meaning, right? They're all illusions. All subjective experience is fundamentally illusory because it's just electrons bumping into each other, right? It's a very deflationary view, and that's why I reject it in some ways, is that like you end up
Right,
unable to really say anything other than laws of
Yeah.
physics and the Big Bang.
Right.
Like that's all you can say, right?
Yeah.
And
Then
yeah,
you're
and then
done.
you're done. You really are. And I think that materialist atheists like Sam Harris, whatever, they don't think very clearly about the fact that like they're using terms that cannot exist in their expressed worldview. And that's where the thing breaks down. It's not that their worldview isn't logically consistent. It's just, what does well-being mean? It's all just atoms. What well-being? There's no well-being. It's just atoms, right? Like, there's no you there even, right? Like, how are you different than the rest of the universe? You're not. It's just atoms, right? And so it all, you can't say anything. You literally lose the power of all speech in some sense, right? You can say Big Bang and you can write the laws of the equations of physics, and that's all there is, right? And so if you want more than that, then you have to enter some other worldview. And yes, then once you admit that there is subjective experience and free will, and you end up buying all these things for that reason, because otherwise you're left with nothing. And so, yes, and most people, Sam Harris included, like they need more than nothing. Like otherwise they wouldn't be able to get up on stage and run their mouth. So, there'd be nothing to say.
Yeah. So we could change track a little bit.
I like
and
ranting
just
against Sam
come to
Harris,
another
actually.
point.
We can do that for the entire hour. No, I'm just kidding.
We one of the things that actually struck me as useful, I almost laughed when I watched this. When I really started thinking about it, is like, the Gnostics were kind of like atheists, kind of, right? In the sense, all your silly gods, they're all demiurges, these guys, but they did say, well, there is a God of all gods, but then they don't ascribe any kind of characteristics to it, right? It's like, well, we can't tell you about it, you can just only experience that reality, right? And of course, it's difficult to communicate that, right? And that's probably why religions, or belief systems that are easy to write down propositionally spread faster, right? It's really hard to communicate a transcendent
correct.
experience on paper,
Correct.
right?
Yeah, that's a
So-
one-to-one kind
but-
of, or maybe not even one-to-one like that. It's
Yeah, I'd be like, you'd have to be in the community. You'd have to like see people who went through it to be convinced that it's available to you. And also, the other thing about it though is, it may be attractive to like an atheist of today, right? It's like, these guys are sort of rejecting all these gods, but they're also talking about some sort of a transcendent experience. But they're not actually, because I think a lot of, my frustration with the new atheists or the material atheists is that they, take all of these religious mythologies as literal, propositional claims. And, which of course, they're easy to defeat, right? Like, the world is obviously not 6,000 years old, therefore everything is wrong, you're an idiot, right? Case closed, I'm done, right? Whereas, in the Gnostics, they just did away with all of the dogma. They're like, the mythology is just a scaffolding. He used this word repeatedly in the lecture. It's just a scaffolding that is used to try to get to a participatory knowing of, the
There's
experience.
a great
right?
Khalil Gibran quote, which I think I've even said before on the podcast, is many a dogma functions as a window. It's something through which you can see the truth, but also that divides you from the truth. There's an interesting notion there, right? And I think that a lot of religions function that way, is that it's like, hey, the dogma existed on some level or came into being maybe from someone often who had this sort of like transcendent experience, is, hey, let me give you a window into this thing instead of you being locked in a room. Okay,
Right.
but then the window itself becomes the obstacle, right? Versus direct experience of the truth, right? This guy stepped outside the house and walked around in there, right? And now he's just built a window for you, so you know there's something out there, right? But then the window itself is kind of the blockade, and I think that then people get caught up in that window. And that's why the Gnostics, the Sufis, are often driven underground by the Orthodox religion, right? Because they're saying that the point is not the window. The point is not the rules or the formal propositional structures. Those were only ever intended to point you toward the spiritual experience, right? And we're free to disregard them and dispense with them in order to actually do that, right? And it's an interesting notion, is that, like, I think that they are saying, hey, get rid of the window and go outside. And the Orthodoxy views it as get rid of the window and stay inside, right? And
no, I think that's exactly right. Here's a thought that just occurred to me as you were saying that, is for the if for the individual, the Gnostic approach of trying to attain a transcendent experience makes the most sense. But for society, orthodoxy makes the most sense.
That's true,
right? Because the problem with having the Gnostics didn't really have any kind of like a moral code, right? Like, oh, let's organize societies like this. Let's have some 10 commandments out, like make sure you don't like screw your neighbor and don't steal and cheat. And this is how we're going to order society. And that's actually pretty important. That's an important forcing function of religions as well. And perhaps social norms get integrated that way into religious systems, to create order. And we just lump it all into religion or culture.
And oddly enough, that's I think that's my conception of the Old Testament God, right? Is that what's saying there out of the axial revolution is, hey, if you don't do this, that's the way I have set up the universe is you're going to be in trouble, right? And so, the personification of that, I think, is maybe an older frame, is that it was God doing it sort of mechanically, rather than just like, these are the laws of human interaction. This is the law of like how societies go down the tubes, right? And so disobey them at your peril, because over time, the people who did have been wiped out, right? And so what we're left with is people that follow these kinds of rules because those experiments were run, right?
But it also points to like an impossibility then of perhaps having a complete system, right? Something that works for the individual, and then also allows. I mean, if you're trying to attain a transcendent experience, if you want to be, I mean, this is one of my frustrations with like Orthodox Islam, and I mean Orthodox Islam. My definition of that is the sort of Wahhabi, Salafi, very strict orthodoxy that's in vogue in Saudi Arabia and many parts of the subcontinent, is they seem to be completely, they're very rigid orthodoxies with very rigid social kind of impositions built in, and that definitely orders society in a very specific way. You can recognize Islamic societies, around the world because they all kind of look very much the same. But they have always felt to me, this is something I think I was very acutely felt when I was growing up, is they felt very spiritually bereft. They felt very dry and sterile, and it's like eating sawdust almost, right? And I felt that. And of course, when you're young, you're like, well, I'm the problem, and I just can't connect. I need to pray harder, or whatever it is. it was a tension, and I am much more, I think, inclined to wanting to quote unquote chase a transcendent experience, right? And I'm not about like orthodoxies.
It's an interesting and beautiful analogy from Speaker for the Dead, actually. Which,
I think in every podcast
you're
just going to bring up Speaker of the Dead.
It's super relevant. But he says that in a religious community, the orthodox conservative elements are like the bones of an animal. Taken alone, they may seem sterile and dead and rigid, but they are the thing against which all the lively elements pull, right? And there's an interesting notion there that society may not be best served by a single type of person. We need a society in which there are rigid people who are saying, do it this way, and this is the way, the thing. Yeah. And we need people who are out chasing transcendent experiences and bringing the value of that in. And that optimum society tries to strike some sort of balance here so that you're not a shapeless pile of gooey muscle, right? But you're also not a dead, rigid skeleton, right? And you're trying to do both in some way as a society. And so, yes, I think there is, going back to your previous point, there is a deep tension between what's best for society and what's best for the individual. And I think that's not surprising. That's as it should be, right? Jung talked about this as, as you are a baby, you grow up, you are socialized. You are brought into society. You're told that you must cover your nakedness and you have to pee in this place and you have to, all these things that you have to do and suppress the urges. You have to suppress your urge to pee just whenever you feel like it and hold it until you can pee in this particular place, right? And your individuality is being suppressed and oppressed, right? And so, and that's necessary because how else would society function? You can't get society to function with a disconnected set of individuals hell-bent on their own particular unique individuality, right? You need some suppression. Well, then you also end up creating the psychological shadow. So he called that the persona. And then in the process of creating the persona, which is the socially acceptable version of yourself or parts of yourself, then you create the shadow, which is the suppressed and obscured parts of yourself. And being whole is finding space to go back and reclaim that shadow and to at least know in the privacy of your own mind and maybe within your own intimate relationships and within your own home who you really are as a totality, right? And to reclaim some of those things, and maybe not all of them, but at least some of them, right? And so I do think that there should be a tension. Society should not accept individuals as they are. It would cease to function, right? Society must impose order and suppress individuals to some degree. Now, how much degree? Again, there's a nuance there, right? But you're never in either direction. Again, we can look at this Wahhabi kind of thing and say, okay, that's too far. That's too much suppression of individuality, right? But it's also possible to go too far in the other direction where society stops functioning because nobody can pull together because they're so dead set on being their individual self, right? And so you've got to, it's an ongoing, difficult mutual balance to kind of strike there.
Also interesting to think about, in just the larger conversation about the human species, right? Like you talked about, our shadow emerges from the civilizational kind of forces that make us civilized. We didn't always live in civilizations and societies, right? We had hunter-gatherers, we had small tribes, American Indian tribes, Aboriginal tribes in South America, had tribes. Groups of Pashtun tribes had groups of dozens of people that made up the quote unquote community, but it was a community, it wasn't a civilization, right? And so I kind of wonder if when there's less civilizing sort of influences like that, that allows for a far greater degree of perhaps individual spirituality, and if in that sense,
I think you can,
those people have access to more possible individuated spiritual experiences. Although at the same time, though, perhaps that small tribe doesn't have any psychotechnologies they could use to bring to bear.
Correct.
On their spirituality, right? They're if you're just born and raised in some Amazon rainforest, never heard of meditation before, and
I mean,
then you don't have that available to you.
these are the pluses and minuses, right? I mean, like, I'll just make a brief aside and then make my main point. The brief aside is, if you look at cities and you chart them sort of according to sort of population density, as the density goes up, there is a significant increase in crime. There's a significant increase in homicide. There's a significant increase in suicide. But there's also a significant increase in creativity and new discoveries and cross-pollination of ideas. And so you can't get it's the density. It's how much people are bumping into each other.
Right.
And then, hey, yeah, you know what?
Right.
If you have 10 million people in a place, the smartest top 0.01% is way smarter than the top 0.01% of 1,000 people, right? And so the number of technologies you're going to get out of that are significantly better and higher. Now, the downside is you're also going to have a bunch of crime. You're also going to have a bunch of, whatever. And then in order to control that, quote unquote, fairly, right? If you have a family or you have a close church group, right? Well, if somebody is, running late because they, weren't feeling well, we can all be very sympathetic to that. Of course we are, right? Of course we say whatever. Somebody's running late to their corporate job at a multi-million-dollar corporation. Nobody cares whether you're not feeling well. We can't. We can't. We have to have order. We have to have rules, and we have to follow and enforce those rules in a way that seems fair, because it will rub off on everybody else if somebody's getting exceptions they're not getting. Whereas you don't run into that issue in a family. Everybody gets exceptions that other people aren't getting. Yeah, that's the way it is, right? It's expected on some level for it to. It's fair in the meta. It's fair in the emotion. Is that we care about everyone equally, and so if and when you run into trouble, then you'll also get some consideration, right? But that's because we know you personally. We're in a community. We're in a tribe, and we can kind of regulate things without needing strict rules enforced impartially. But after a certain size, you need rules that are enforced impartially in order to maintain that sense of fairness. And it changes things to move from, as you said, from tribes to civilization.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good insight. The other thing that kind of struck me was the conspiratorial nature of the sort of Gnostic mythology, not Gnosis itself, but just the mythology, right, where you have this sort of otherization, right, potentially otherization, but you definitely have, and this is a bit interesting, this is the part of the mythology that is problematic for me, but also resonates with me, which is that you have this idea that there are these externalizing forces causing your suffering, right? And that's very apropos to the modern times that we live in, especially I would say the last perhaps 5 years, since COVID, where I think there has been, it's been going on for these last 5 years, so it's a boiling the frog phenomenon, right? But there's just greater and greater sense of institutional collapse. At least we're both in the U.S., and I think that sense is prevalent here. There's less and less confidence in the monetary economic systems and the justice system, the political system, the education. I mean, name the system, right? And people are more and more aware that these systems are kind of imposed on us, right? And the analogy of an incompetent demiurge, right, or a large abstractive kind of intelligent principle that operates on us, right? Being incompetent or malevolent, people think both, right, of the U.S. government these days. That it's interesting how old an idea that is.
That is fascinating. I'll agree with that. I do agree with that. It's interesting to trace that back and realize, this is not a new idea.
It's an old idea.
I think there's some interesting notions there. I think that part of that, I've wondered. People are getting more intelligent over time. The Flynn effect, it's called, right? Is that every decade or decade and a half, you have to renormalize the IQ curves because what was average 100 has gone up, right? And we keep having to readjust. So 100 IQ today is not 100 IQ in 1900. Like we've been doing intelligence tests that long. The reason I mentioned that is that part of what intelligence is pattern finding. It's the ability to detect larger and larger abstract patterns. And I think the opportunity then, and we add on things like big data and AI and so on and so forth, is the opportunity to find false patterns. And a conspiracy on theory on some level is the dream that there is a pattern, it's not just random noise, right? And the more abstract or complex of a pattern you're able to spot, the more likely it is that you're going to assign pattern to something that is truly random, and you're going to be, as Nassim Taleb would say, fooled by randomness, right? And so I think that is one of the ongoing dangers of the increasing intelligence. Both computing intelligence and human intelligence both are rising, and I think we even more so. It's interesting to think how old this idea is, but I think we are broadly even more at risk going forward for these reasons of making this error. But
Yeah, no, that's I didn't think about that. That the problem would actually get worse, not better, because even though we have these AI models, we don't really know how they have there's this black box effect of like you don't really know how they came up with this output, so you can't really go back and check the homework and like, oh, that's how this is absolutely true. You're going to have to decide if the output it's giving you is true or not, and that's just going to feed your conspiracy theory. So you're just right back where you started, but now you have an AI to feed your conspiracy theories.
And that's
right?
the issue I have with people's blind belief in AI leading in positive directions towards truth, is I don't think there's any guarantee of that. And Taleb has done the mathematical work. If you're interested in sort of the proof of this, that it would not necessarily, that big data is not going to solve these problems, like Taleb is the one who kind of is working on these things, right? That it ultimately, big data does not solve the problem of garbage in, garbage out, right? And so, I think we see that in any of the big data sets. We've had big data sets showing random, DNA says, oh, these 5 different polymorphisms create a 70% penetration of creating diabetes. And it's like, okay, you just found a random pattern in the multiple billion data set that you had, right? And so, yeah, I think that is one thing that I struggle with. The other, if I can take us in a slightly different direction, the other thing that occurred to me on that topic is, and I'll see if I can phrase this correctly. I'll just work it out maybe in real time here. Something like the thing that Buddha was pointing out is the danger of dukkha, right? The danger of self-deception, of saying, hey, I perceive I perceive mythologically this notion that I am being oppressed, that I'm in a system that is sort of thwarting my goals, right? For self-development, for whatever the goals are, right? And then to assign that to say, okay, not just mythologically, but there must be someone really thwarting my goals, and to engage in self-deception and parasitic processing, and to perceive yourself as a helpless victim of this system without the power to change it, not realizing that the actual mythological oppression can be solved in the Gnostic way by self-transcendence, right? That the solution is not to go protest in reality the
Kill
Jews, that we need to kill them all in a Holocaust, right? Which is the Nazi solution to that perception, is we are being thwarted as a society from achieving what we want. Well, now I'm going to look in the real world, and now I engage in self-deception and parasitic processing and go down this whole thing, rather than saying, oh, that sense, that felt sense of being thwarted means that I need to transcend. I need to find the transcendent, and it is a call to individual growth, not breaking the system in some sense.
Yeah, and this is where it's difficult to know how to operationalize the idea, right? Is that, okay, sure, So what does self-transcendence exactly mean, right? So it could mean you just move to a new country where there are no Jews. I have transcended the problem. I have transcended myself to this other
Sure.
country, and now I have fixed the
I don't know
problem.
if you
Right? You know,
I don't know that you
to be
transcended yourself so much as you've transcended the country, and that may not be quite the solution there.
But the idea, you know, one thing that Gnostics, or at least this explanation, did not really talk about is, yes, you can transcend the gods, but should you kill some of them as you go up the hierarchy there of reality? You know, because they're, you know, dismissive of the gods, right? But if these gods are entrapping you, ensnaring you, and causing your suffering, it creates the, at least, you know, philosophical scaffolding to justify, you know, and we, you know, he's even said can result in violence and the idea of otherization as well, especially if, you know, gods are perceived as a group of people, you know, the demiurges are perceived as a group of people, or at least the followers of a demiurge are a group of people that should be attacked. It's hard to know. Like, a good example here is that if, for example, you think, you know, racism is a demiurge in your society, or the money system is, or, you know, your gender, you know, roles are, whatever it is, right? You just assign that the value of a demiurge, and you're like, well, I have to. This is entrapping me, right? Now, he talked about the Matrix, right? Now, let's all remember that, you know, Neo didn't transcend, right? He killed, you know, Agent Smith at the end, right? So he's like, he kicked his ass.
Merged
You know,
with and
in
by
a
the
sense,
third one,
right?
so that's a separate interesting point. But yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. But in a sense that he defeated it, right? At the end of the first movie, we thought that the agent was dead, right? Yes, forget about what happens in the next few movies, but the end of that story resulted in a clear defeat of the overlords, the demiurges, right? And the beginning of a battle with them, right? So, in fact, the very last words of the movie was he was talking to them. He says, I'm bringing the battle to you," is essentially what he was saying, right? I'm going to war with you, right? Now, there's no self-transcending there. He's like, hey, I'm coming to kick your ass. And if, you know, to the extent that this mythology is useful, it doesn't really inform us about what to do with the demiurges, right? It gives us a good model of saying, yes, there may be externalizing forces that cause us to suffer, but what do you do with that information? You know? And this is also, you know, and again, maybe this is explicated elsewhere, but when he did talk about Neoplatonism, and this is something that you also referred to, is like, what does it mean to ascend, right? And my quick, you know, answer to that, well, you know, there's some sense of the sacred and the good, but again, you know, outside of a mythological framework, what does that mean? Like, how do I live differently day to day, right? Should I be nicer, kinder, more assertive, less assertive, work harder, work less hard? I mean, all those things that we grapple with as practical decision-making points day to day. Well, at least I grapple with them, right? Figuring out how to strike the right balance between things like aggression and passivity, being nice and being assertive, being generous and being stingy with my resources. All of those you know, we talked about this, you know, before. A good frame to ask yourself when you're approaching a problem is, what is the wise thing to do, right? Then, you know, the answer to that is far from obvious most of the time, but framing it in that way is very important, right? Like, there should be this idea that there's a wiser way to do unfold your life compared to another way. And there was nothing in this particular explication of Gnosis and Neoplatonism that gave me anything to feed that decision engine, right? And I don't know if it's out there, you know, if maybe Neoplatonism is limited to a sort of mystic tradition. I don't know, I really don't know the answer to that. I don't know if you know more about Neoplatonism than I do.
Well, let's see if we can work our way. I think there is something there, but first, actually, just commenting on the end of the Matrix, right? That's not actually what he says, and I think the creators were careful enough, right? He says, "I'm going to show these people what you don't want them to see, a world without rules and limits, and what happens after that is up to you, or I leave to you." Right? So it's an interestingly nuanced frame. Is that like, I'm going to show them, and then where we go from there, you know, it's an interesting notion, right?
Sure.
So, but leaving aside the degree to which the Matrix is like that accurately a reflection of Gnosticism, I think that how do I say this? framework of progression through demiurges may not lead to destruction of those demiurges, but reconsideration. And we've even kind of done that a little bit in this conversation, right? Is that I think that from one point of view, you consider the stories of the Old Testament as literal historical recountings of events, right? And that's one frame of how to conceive of that. And then I think transcendence, to some degree, is the notion of saying, okay, maybe they weren't literal events. Maybe what's being said here is that this is how the universe is set up. This is how the human social universe is set up. That if you behave in certain ways, you're going to get smacked around, right? And in the long run, and in ways that may not seem obvious, right? Peterson talks about this, is that like, you know, if you think you can lie and get away with it, he's like, I've never seen anyone get away with anything ever. Like, and that's a profound thing to say, right? Is that at some point you're suffering and you track it back, and it's like, oh, because he calls it twisting the fabric of reality, right? And you think you can twist the fabric of reality and not have it snap back? Well, no, it's not, right? And that's what the Old Testament is sort of saying mythologically. That's the mythological understanding. And so I think you have to transcend the literal understanding. And it's not that you get rid of the Old Testament God. You just understand it differently once you've transcended it. It doesn't mean the death of the Old. It's all true on some level. It's just not true in the way you thought it was true. Right? It's not true in maybe the ontological sense. It's true in a psychological sense. That's one form of transcendence, and I think that can be true of a lot of these demiurges. Is I think that these demiurges can be there for a reason, and when like the window pane that we talked about, right? It's there for a reason. It's not put there by someone evil in some sense, although it may be doing something evil by dividing you from the truth, evil, right? But it wasn't put there for that reason. And once you understand it, it's like, well, if the window hadn't been there, I may never have known that there was a world outside, right? Now, once it was there, it became aware of it, and then also became aware that there was something I needed to go outside somehow, and then it became its own obstacle that I had to transcend. And I think a lot of the demiurges are that way in some sense, is that like, yeah, you don't have to kill them off, but you do have to say, okay, hey, these traditional gender roles or whatever the deal is, right? Like, maybe they weren't just put there out of evil. Like, maybe they were put there because there's something functional in that you need to understand, while at the same time not needing to adhere to them rigidly, as though they are natural law, right? And say, okay, well, actually, if I understand deeply what they were there to do in an intuitive sense, in a mythological sense, in a Gnostic sense, then I don't have to follow them rigidly, right? Now, if I don't understand what they were there to do and I just discard them, then I may end up in some serious trouble as well.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. I guess transcending the demiurges to some extent might even involve interacting with them in ways so that they're changed, right? So you relate to them differently, I suppose, right? But, you know, even ensconced with that idea is, well, how do you do that, right? Do you rip it up from the roots and you know, like, I mean, you know, if, for example, if you think, say, the economic system, right, or the political system that you're oppressed by, that demiurge is difficult. I mean, then you could transcend it by running for president and changing the country and all that stuff, right? Where you're being an activist and then trying to change it from within. And, you know, in some sense you have transcended it, but you've also engaged with it in a very intimate way, right? So I get what you're saying, is that you could you could reinterpret, I suppose, is one way of putting it, right? You could view it differently. You could relate to it differently. And all those are perhaps some ways of transcending it. But you're also changing it, right? And change is, when you're changing something, it's never passive, and there's never not resistance. So the demiurges will fight back your attempts to realign yourself to them, right? And then you have conflict again, and then the question is, what is the wise thing to do in that scenario, right? I don't know if this will be explicated further, but my sense of it is that this entire thing was this lecture specifically was reinforced the idea of non-propositional and non-propositional participatory types of knowing and experiences, right? It further reinforces that idea that there can be profound truths to have that do not live in propositional space,
Sure.
right?
And by the way, the top comment at the bottom of this video was, everybody's a gangster until they fail to engage in participatory knowing. And so, you can't summarize it any better than that, honestly. That's the truest summary.
I think that's I think that's fair. It's a fair
No,
summary.
I think I think that there's truth in that. The other thing I would add that I see as a pattern, and you may disagree, but I feel like this is a pattern as well, is part of that transcendent experience, and maybe one of the ways of operationalizing this is, I think that what is demanded of you is to manage to become comfortable with uncertainty without being frozen into immobility. And part of what people look for in the demiurges, I think, and conspiracy theories, is certainty. Because transcendence it leaves you uncertain. Like, now I don't know what the rules are. Now it's up to me to figure out what parts of these traditions are rooted in something important and what parts can I ignore and when. And there aren't rules, right? There isn't that rigidly enforced code. And I think that the appeal of kind of very fundamentalist, like even Wahhabi Islam and like all these kinds of more, even Trumpism, I think any of these things are expressions of discomfort with uncertainty. But the flip side of that is, okay, cool, I can just sit in uncertainty and be frozen into immobility and do nothing because I'm not sure what the truth is. I'm not sure how generous to be or how aggressive to be so I'll just do nothing, right, until I'm sure, right? And even that's not really true comfort with uncertainty. I think comfort with uncertainty is, I don't know, and I'm going to make my best guess and try to do the wise thing and recognize that sometimes I'll get it wrong. And that's the world as it is, right? That's the truth of the world as it is, right? And to recognize that everybody else is doing the same thing. And there isn't necessarily the malevolence. It's just everybody's trying to get through the best way they know how. And, like, I can disagree and I can try and, like, I think that people are wrong, right? But I've been wrong too at other times, right? And so, I don't know, I think that's some of the messages that some of these transcendent teachers are trying to give. In other words, is like, I mean, that Jesus, or the traditional thing is that, like, there but for the grace of God go I, in some sense, or seeing yourself in other people, is that notion of like, hey, yeah, I've made those mistakes. Like, cast not the mote from, what is it? Cast not the mote from your neighbor's eye before you deal with the mite in your own, or something. There's some older phrasing that I'm forgetting, but all of those things are kind of pushing away from the victim mindset, pushing away from being frozen, not doing anything, but also into the embrace of uncertainty of like, yeah, it's not going to be any clearer. Like, you're never going to get clarity on the correct amount of aggression to have in a particular circumstance. What you will get is comfort with the uncertainty and the ability to move forward. And that's actually in some ways a more important goal.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Yeah. Well, I don't know if you had any other thoughts on the lecture.
Yeah, I think we covered it pretty well, man. Next time.
We will discuss St. Augustine next.
Excellent.